They butchered us. No mercy, no hesitation. We let them in, and they carved us apart like livestock. The words spilled from Lieutenant Orendek's trembling lips, his hands slick with someone else's blood. His armored chest plate bore deep slashes, one side shattered from kinetic impact. He swayed in his seat, head lolling forward before Commander Ragos Ven seized his shoulders, locking him in place. "Stay with me, soldier. What did you see?" Deck's swollen eyes darted wildly, searching for something beyond the shattered viewport. The command deck reeked of burned flesh, coolant, and the metallic tang of ruptured plating. Sparks rained from exposed conduits, hissing as they hit the bodies slumped against the walls. The overhead lighting flickered, casting grotesque shadows across the dead. We opened the docking gates. They sent diplomats, harmless, polite, unarmed. Deck sucked in a breath that rattled. Then the lights died. And they were everywhere. The ISS Ragnarok floated in the dying embers of what had once been New Ephora, a thriving colony, reduced to molten ruin in a matter of hours. The planetary crust had fractured like a brittle skull, deep fissures belching plumes of superheated gas into the void. From orbit, the colony's remains resembled a festering wound, its structures now little more than blackened ribs jutting from a sea of magma. The Galactic Concord had not just attacked. They had exterminated. Ven's jaw tightened as the ship's heads-up display projected the casualty count. The numbers kept rising, the last desperate transmissions from the ground scrolling like obituaries on a death reel. Civilians, scientists, children, all wiped out before they could even understand what was happening. And for what? There had been no war, no ultimatums, no warnings. Just a clean sweep. Deck's breath hitched, his fingers twitching against the exposed wiring of his seat restraints. It wasn't an invasion, sir. It was a purge. Ven stood, his armored boots grinding over shattered display glass. His reflection stared back at him from the curved steel panel of the command dais. Blood spattered across his shoulder guard, his face cast in sharp relief under the emergency lighting. His dark gaze flicked to the bridge crew, waiting, silent, watching. Every one of them had lost someone. "Sir." The comms officer's voice was tight, barely restrained. "We've decrypted a message from the Concord's flagship, a transmission from the executioners." Ven exhaled slowly, his body still as the officer fed the recording through the command interface. The laser plasma display ignited, a translucent wave of light folding into the shape of a figure, alien, angular, and eerily composed. Minister Vakor, of the Galactic Concord High Council. "Humanity of soul," the alien intoned, its mandibles clicking. "You were permitted entry into the stars under false pretenses. You masqueraded as equals, yet you are nothing more than an aberration, a species of parasites. Your survival was a mistake that we now rectify." Silence crushed the bridge. "Do not seek vengeance. Do not attempt resistance. You are already forgotten." The transmission cut, leaving behind only the distant wail of proximity alarms. Ven's pulse slowed, his thoughts turning razor-sharp. Forgotten? Number. They had just made the worst mistake in their species' history. "Lieutenant Nova, get me the Vanguard Council." His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of something heavier than rage. "Sir, do it now!" Nova's hands flew across the control panel, keying in the long-range burst relay. The tactical interface flickered as encrypted military channels scrambled to establish a secured line. Ven turned his gaze to the viewport, to the corpse of New Ephira smoldering below. No games, only retribution. "They thought we'd beg." The words dripped from Fleet Marshal Corsa Adakir's lips like molten iron, his massive form seated at the war table, fingers steepled. The war chamber, hidden deep beneath the Callisto stronghold, pulsed with hard red lighting, the atmosphere thick with barely restrained fury. Across from him, Counselor Arsha Voros tapped her nails against the carbon steel surface. She had been the lone voice advocating for peace. Now she looked as if she had swallowed glass. "They hit 17 colonies. They burned every single one of them to the ground. That's not politics. That's not negotiation." Ven leaned forward, his voice low, deliberate. "That is genocide." Silence. Then Adakir chuckled, a sound that sent a ripple through the chamber. Then we stopped pretending. Nova exchanged a glance with Ven, her jaw set. "Sir, the Concord will expect a counterattack. They're preparing for war." Ven's expression darkened. "No, Lieutenant. They are preparing for an enemy who still plays by the rules." He straightened, pressing a sequence into the war table's console. A new directive appeared on the main display. Operation. Spectre Protocol activated. A hush fell over the officers as the directive's meaning sank in. The Ghost Fleet. Humanity's contingency plan, hidden deep within classified war archives, long dismissed as paranoia. They had mapped every enemy station, every trade hub, every critical weak point for decades. They had never intended to use it. Until now. "Full strategic blackout," Ven ordered. "All civilian assets withdrawn. Every trader, every diplomat, every single ship, gone." The officers began keying in system-wide disengagement orders, silent figures in the dim chamber. Adakir smirked. "And what will the Concord think, seeing our space go dark?" Ven turned, his voice as cold as the void. "They will believe they have won." The war table flickered again. Projected coordinates filled the space above them, calculated strike points, insertion paths, a map of silent destruction. Nova inhaled sharply. "Sir, if we do this, there's no coming back." Ven exhaled, his eyes locked on the rising numbers of the fallen. There was never a way back. Adakir grinned. "Time to remind them why the galaxy fears Deathworlders." As the first Ghost Fleet vessels slipped from their hidden docks, the Galactic Concord still basked in its hollow victory. They did not yet realize what was coming. But they would, and by then, it would be far too late. "They'll be watching the front gates," Adakir muttered, gaze locked on the pulsating laser plasma display. "So we slipped through the cracks." Commander Ragos Ven leaned against the reinforced bulkhead, his fingers tapping a measured rhythm against his wrist console. The room's red lighting cast angular shadows across his face, sharpening the quiet resolve in his expression. On the screen before them, the Ghost Fleet was already vanishing. Ships detached from hidden docks beneath Europa's ice, from derelict refueling stations cloaked in nebula dust, from scrapyards where decommissioned freighters had been reforged into something else entirely. Thousands of vessels, unregistered, unseen, untraceable. A shadow army that had existed only in contingency files, until now. 2,000 years of interstellar diplomacy, Counselor Arsha murmured from the corner, and we still fall for the same arrogance, the same blind faith in our own invulnerability. Ven didn't look at her. The weight of her words was already pressing against his chest, a reminder of what had been lost beneath New Ephra's broken crust. But regret was an indulgence they could not afford. "We don't need them to see us coming," he said quietly. "We need them to believe we aren't coming at all." The room swelled with silence. On the main display, the last of humanity's civilian traffic winked out of the Concord's trade routes. The migration was swift, clinical. Cargo haulers docked at Concord-controlled stations powered down their engines, quietly offloading their final shipments before slipping into the black. Human diplomats excused themselves from negotiations mid-sentence, their departure notices cold and formal. Every human bank account within Concord space was emptied in a single synchronized event, financial conduits bleeding dry in real time. Stock markets flickered, and trade analysts scrambled to explain the sudden, inexplicable retreat. To the rest of the galaxy, it looked like humanity had simply folded. The Concord would call it a silent surrender. Their leaders would sit back in their high towers, satisfied that the problem had resolved itself. They wouldn't realize until it was too late that they'd just been left alone in a room with a loaded gun. Nova's voice broke through the low tension. "Commander, fleet positioning is finalized. Vanguard Command requests confirmation of blackout protocol." Ven exhaled slowly. His fingers hovered over the activation key, the final step in a sequence set into motion years before anyone in that room had drawn their first breath. One press, and humanity, would become an absence, a specter slipping between the cracks of the galaxy's defenses. He keyed the command. The stars blinked out. The laser plasma display shifted. Every human transmission, every broadcast, every military frequency collapsed into silence. The Concord's war analysts, their intelligence officers, their watchful eyes across the void, they would see the same thing. Nothing. For the first time in recorded history, humanity had disappeared. The war had already begun. The bridge of the ISS Revenant was eerily still. Outside the viewport, space was a churning storm of ion trails and burning debris, remnants of a derelict outpost that had been stripped for parts before the Concord could repurpose it. Lieutenant Valen Drast, the ship's infiltration specialist, crouched over the tactical console, eyes darting between the shifting heads-up display projections. His movements were sharp, efficient, a quiet contrast to the tension crawling beneath his skin. "This will work," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "It will," Nova replied from the captain's chair, voice measured, unreadable. Drast's jaw flexed. He had no reason to doubt her. She was one of the best pilots in the fleet, her instincts sharper than most fire control algorithms. Still, this plan required more than just skill. It required flawless deception. The Revenant wasn't a warship, not to anyone scanning for one. Its hull plating had been scrubbed of all identifiable markers, its transponder cycling between false registry codes. To the Concord's patrol ships, it was just another abandoned freighter drifting off course, a flicker of insignificance in the shadow of their armadas. Drast's fingers hovered over the secondary infiltration terminal, his breathing shallow. "We're in their system," he murmured. "Ghost key is live. Decoy transmissions are in place." Nova didn't acknowledge it. She didn't need to. The plan had been drilled into their bones. They weren't breaching security. They were rewriting it. The Concord's automated defense grids, its planetary surveillance arrays, its early warning networks, they weren't being hacked. They were being taught, slowly, subtly, to ignore what they weren't meant to see. One ship, then another, then another. Across the Concord's strongholds, human vessels were already inside their defenses, unnoticed, stationed at their ports, embedded in their traffic lanes, positioned beside their supply convoys. Ships that had been there for weeks, months, years, now silent, waiting, no alarms, no alerts. To the Concord's security systems, nothing had changed, and that was the point. Nova's gaze flickered to Drast. "Relay the clearance codes. Let them think we belong." Drast's fingers danced across the interface. "Done. We're through." A beat of stillness. Then the ship's nav systems realigned, responding to the new directives as though they had always been part of the protocol. Drast exhaled. "We're in their house." Nova's lips curled in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then let's set the table." Deep in the Concord's heartland, Minister Vakor's personal flagship sat anchored above the planet of Kalar Prime, its reflective hull gleaming in the artificial twilight. Within the command chamber, Vakor traced a clawed finger over the data streams flooding his private terminal. Something was missing. The human withdrawal should have sparked panic, disorder, desperate attempts at negotiation. Instead, the silence stretched on. No distress calls, no diplomatic outreach, no retaliation. That wasn't right. Humans were reactionary. They were undisciplined creatures, prone to emotional outbursts and foolish acts of defiance. That was what history had taught them. So, why weren't they doing anything? "Minister," a voice crackled over the comms, "we have an anomaly in the trade routes. Human transports have all vacated their posts, but we're detecting residual network activity from their last transmissions." Vakor's eyes narrowed. "Elaborate." "It's—" The officer hesitated. "It's nothing. There's no active signal, but the timestamps indicate they didn't just disconnect. They synchronized. Every terminal, every system, every communications buoy, they shut down at the exact same moment. It's too clean." Vakor's claws tapped against the control panel. A hollow, empty sound. "You're suggesting this was planned?" I don't know, Minister. But something feels wrong. A sharp click as Vakor terminated the channel. The last remnants of New Afira's destruction flickered across his display, the ruined colony still smoldering under the weight of their cleansing fire. The humans had lost. They should have been drowning in grief, struggling for survival, reaching for desperate retaliation. Instead, they had gone quiet. Too quiet. Vakor's mandibles clenched. Somewhere, beyond the reach of his sensors, humanity was watching. And he had the distinct, unwelcome feeling that they were waiting for him to blink first. They're blind. Nova's voice was cool, almost detached, as she studied the shifting figures on the laser plasma display. It painted a brutal truth in jagged lines. The Galactic Concord had no idea what was coming. Their fleet formations were rigid, designed for repelling known threats, but this was something else entirely. Drast exhaled, gaze fixed on the orbital security grid that should have been detecting them by now. They still think we're licking our wounds. Commander Ragos Ven watched in silence, his mind cutting through the variables. They believe what they need to believe, he murmured, and we've given them nothing else to consider. Beneath them, Kalar Prime turned lazily in the darkness, oblivious. The cityscape glowed in layered rings, pulsing with the quiet hum of industry. Military vessels idled in neat formations above the surface, their pilots confident, relaxed, unaware that humanity's blade was already at their throats. Ven leaned forward, fingers curling around the reinforced console. Are the Ghost Fleet assets in position? Deployed across 7 sectors, Nova confirmed. They've slipped into formation around the major Concord supply lines. Their warships aren't scanning deep enough. We're sitting between their patrol paths like shadows under a doorframe. Drast smirked. And when they realize what's happening? By then, Ven said quietly, it won't matter. A ripple of static broke across the heads-up display, a coded burst from an embedded operative. The signal was faint, almost lost within the usual traffic of the planetary defense network, but it was there. The contact was in place. Patch it through, Ven ordered. The display flickered, resolving into the faint outline of Agent Kes Meroan, barely visible beneath the dim emergency lighting of a maintenance corridor. The lines of his face were taut, drawn in sharp relief against the cold glow of his data slate. He didn't waste time on greetings. Vanguard Command, this is Meroan. I have confirmation High Minister Vakor is aboard the flagship Varakis and will remain docked for another 12 cycles. Ven's grip on the console tightened fractionally. Security measures? Standard fleet defense grid, but... Meroan hesitated, eyes flicking to something out of frame. They've been reallocating assets, pulling ships from the outer colonies, rerouting them toward the inner sanctum. It's not mobilization, it's consolidation. They're bracing for something. Nova's expression sharpened. They're not expecting an invasion, but they know something's wrong. Ven didn't move, but a slow, calculating thought was forming in the back of his mind. The Concord wasn't hunting. They were hiding. What else? Meroan exhaled. There's something deeper happening, sir. Trade disruptions, corporate withdrawals. It's spooking them. I heard a transmission from one of their diplomatic sectors. They're losing external allies. Other species are pulling their assets from Concord-controlled space. It's subtle, but... He trailed off. Ven finished the thought. They're isolating themselves. It was small, almost imperceptible, but the implications were enormous. Something had unsettled the Concord. Orders? Meroan prompted. Ven's response was immediate. Sit tight. Maintain cover. If you're compromised, understood. The connection severed. A heavy pause settled over the bridge. Drast exhaled, rolling his shoulders like a predator before the strike. So, they know something's coming, but they don't know what. We use that. Ven's gaze never left the planet below. The city lights shimmered like a beast sleeping in a nest of embers. No. His voice was steady, deliberate. We let them suffocate in their own fear. 3 hours later, the first strikes landed. They were small, surgical, barely noticeable, until they weren't. The primary shipping relay over Drakari outpost flickered, then died, its station operators scrambling to reboot systems that simply refused to respond. Across the Concord's outer defense grid, automated turrets turned inward, targeting nothing, ghost signals embedded within their command lines, sending them into quiet disarray. Civilian transports, too deeply embedded in human trade networks to function independently, began dropping from communication channels, their captains scrambling for answers, and then the real damage began. On Kalar Prime, the city lost power, not everywhere, just enough. The main transit system locked down, trapping thousands of military personnel in underground networks. Security beacons blinked into emergency standby, leaving vital stations unmonitored. Artificial gravity systems faltered, throwing entire sectors into momentary chaos. From the outside, it seemed like a technical failure. Inside the Concord's command chambers, it was a growing nightmare. Vakor's claws dug into the armrest of his chair as he watched the laser plasma display stutter with incomplete status reports. "Someone explain to me," he said, voice unnervingly calm, "why my planetary security feeds just collapsed." His officers hesitated. One, a Tarkari analyst with the look of a man aging by the second, fumbled with his interface. The display flickered, resolving into the faint outline of Agent Kes Maroan, barely visible beneath the dim emergency lighting of a maintenance corridor. The lines of his face were taut, drawn in sharp relief against the cold glow of his data slate. He didn't waste time on greetings. "Vanguard Command, this is Maroan. I have confirmation High Minister Vakor is aboard the flagship Varakis and will remain docked for another 12 cycles." Ven's grip on the console tightened fractionally. "Security measures? Standard fleet defense grid, but—" Maroan hesitated, eyes flicking to something out of frame. "They've been reallocating assets, pulling ships from the outer colonies, rerouting them toward the inner sanctum. It's not mobilization, it's consolidation. They're bracing for something." Nova's expression sharpened. "They're not expecting an invasion, but they know something's wrong." Ven didn't move, but a slow, calculating thought was forming in the back of his mind. The Concord wasn't hunting. They were hiding. "What else?" Maroan exhaled. "There's something deeper happening, sir. Trade disruptions, corporate withdrawals. It's spooking them. I heard a transmission from one of their diplomatic sectors. They're losing external allies. Other species are pulling their assets from Concord-controlled space. It's subtle, but—" He trailed off. Ven finished the thought. "They're isolating themselves." It was small, almost imperceptible, but the implications were enormous. Something had unsettled the Concord. "Orders?" Maroan prompted. Ven's response was immediate. "Sit tight. Maintain cover. If you're compromised—" "Understood." The connection severed. A heavy pause settled over the bridge. Drast exhaled, rolling his shoulders like a predator before the strike. "So, they know something's coming, but they don't know what. We use that." Ven's gaze never left the planet below. The city lights shimmered like a beast sleeping in a nest of embers. "No." His voice was steady, deliberate. "We let them suffocate in their own fear." 3 hours later, the first strikes landed. They were small, surgical, barely noticeable, until they weren't. The primary shipping relay over Drakari outpost flickered, then died, its station operators scrambling to reboot systems that simply refused to respond. Across the Concord's outer defense grid, automated turrets turned inward, targeting nothing, ghost signals embedded within their command lines, sending them into quiet disarray. Civilian transports, too deeply embedded in human trade networks to function independently, began dropping from communication channels, their captains scrambling for answers, and then the real damage began. On Kalar Prime, the city lost power, not everywhere, just enough. The main transit system locked down, trapping thousands of military personnel in underground networks. Security beacons blinked into emergency standby, leaving vital stations unmonitored. Artificial gravity systems faltered, throwing entire sectors into momentary chaos. From the outside, it seemed like a technical failure. Inside the Concord's command chambers, it was a growing nightmare. Vakor's claws dug into the armrest of his chair as he watched the laser plasma display stutter with incomplete status reports. "Someone explain to me," he said, voice unnervingly calm, "why my planetary security feeds just collapsed." His officers hesitated. One, a Tarkari analyst with the look of a man aging by the second, fumbled with his interface. "It's a system error, Minister. We've detected no breaches, no unauthorized—" The war room doors hissed open. A figure strode inside, her coat sweeping behind her like a blade through the stagnant air. Admiral Sirik Halos. Vakor turned to her sharply. "Tell me you have better news." "I don't," she said bluntly. "And if you don't start listening to what's happening, you won't have a fleet left to command." She stepped forward, palming a data slate onto the central console. The display shifted, exposing a map of recent disruptions across conquered space. They weren't random, they were coordinated. Vakor studied the data, his exoskeletal fingers tightening. "You think this is human interference?" Sirik's gaze was cold. "I think we're in the middle of a war that we didn't notice starting." A hush fell over the room. The data spoke for itself. Not a single human warship had been detected. Not a single battle had been declared. Yet Concord's infrastructure was collapsing. Vakor's mandibles clicked once, a slow, deliberate sound. "Find them," he ordered. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was already too late. Because this was never about being found. This was about being forgotten, until the blade was already in their throat. Vakor's talons tapped against the cold alloy of his command chair, the sound barely audible over the frantic exchange of voices in the war chamber. The laser plasma displays flickered with corrupted data, showing fragmented reports of planetary failures, ship malfunctions, and entire supply lines vanishing into nothingness. "I said find them," he snarled, mandibles flaring. But no one had an answer, because there was nothing to find. His gaze locked onto Admiral Sirik Halos, who stood with arms crossed, her weathered face impassive. She wasn't panicking. That made him uneasy. "You're too quiet, Admiral." "Because you're asking the wrong question," she replied, eyes fixed on the map of conquered space. The usual rhythm of patrol routes had turned jagged, frenzied. Entire fleet formations were repositioning like blind creatures groping for a threat they couldn't see. "What should I be asking, then?" Her silver pupils flicked to him. "Not where they are." She gestured toward the disappearing supply chains. "Where they aren't." Silence fell over the war chamber. Vakor's breath slowed as the realization took shape. The humans weren't attacking. They were subtracting. Deep within the wreckage of an abandoned Concord shipyard, the ISS Revenant drifted between floating debris, its engines running cold. Inside the reinforced command center, Ven and Nova studied the heads-up display, their faces illuminated by the eerie blue glow of intercepted transmissions. "They're scrambling," Nova murmured. "They're running defense scenarios that don't make sense, shooting at sensor ghosts. Even their top-tier officers are breaking formation." Drast gave a low chuckle, barely audible over the pulse of activity around them. "Fear does strange things to a command structure." Ven remained motionless, watching the screen as fleet reports stacked in real time. Every supply chain had been severed. Every major trade hub was silent. The Concord had built its empire on infrastructure, on the meticulous balance of logistics, supply, and control, and now that foundation was cracking. "Sir," Nova said, her voice measured, "we just got confirmation from Ghost Fleet Relay. Phobos's caches are active. All teams have disengaged clean." The meaning hung heavy in the air. Every single one of the Concord's military stockpiles had been emptied by their own security systems. The humans hadn't just hijacked their supply network, they had rewritten it. Ven's fingers flexed against the console. "Then we let them starve." On Kaler Prime, an unnatural silence had settled over the once bustling capital. Streetlights flickered erratically, as if struggling to hold their glow. Automated patrol drones hovered uselessly, their guidance systems trapped in an endless loop of recalibrations. And in the military barracks, the food rations were gone. The Concord's officers were just starting to understand the depth of their mistake. "We had reserves," one officer stammered, staring at the empty supply depot as if sheer disbelief could refill it. Enough for 6 cycles. His superior, a veteran strategist named Korath Mav, moved with sharp, deliberate steps through the barren storage room. Every crate was still sealed. Every inventory record showed full capacity. And yet, there was nothing. Not stolen, not destroyed, just gone. Mav's voice was tight when he activated his comms. "I need direct contact with High Command, now." A garbled response came through, layered with static. "Requisitions, planetary-wide shortages." He clenched his jaw. "Repeat that transmission. Who authorized these relocations?" More static. Then, "They were authorized internally. The system. It logged as a scheduled supply shift. But no one in command gave the order." A chill ran through Mav's spine. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't sabotage. The humans had reached inside their system and unraveled it from within. Aboard the Varakis, Vakor stared at the transmission reports, his mind racing. They turned our supply network into a noose. It wasn't just military rations. Every fuel stockpile, every weapons cache, every energy reserve had been drained, without a single explosion, without a single shot fired. For the first time since this war had begun, he felt cold. He turned to Sirik. "Tell me we still have fuel stores on the outer colonies." Her expression didn't change. "If we do, they won't be there tomorrow." His mandibles twitched in frustration. "Then we recall our fleets. Get them back into defensive formation. Now." She didn't move. "Minister," she said slowly, "I don't think you understand." His claws curled into fists. "Understand what?" Sirik leaned forward, her tone dangerously calm. "They're not here to fight us." She pointed at the flickering, disjointed fleet positions scattered across the screen. "They're here to make sure no one ever fights them again." Vakor's breath stalled. It hit him then, the weight of the realization crashing over him. The humans weren't aiming for victory. They were removing the Concord from history. The first true attack came without warning. Not a fleet, not a bombardment, a freighter. Vakor barely had time to register the impact warning before the entire war chamber shuddered violently, throwing officers against walls, data consoles flickering wildly. The Varaki's hull screamed as something ruptured deep within its lower decks. "Report!" he barked, struggling to steady himself. A junior technician, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, gasped for air. Something just appeared inside the ship. It bypassed all scans, all security sweeps. A second impact, and then a third. This wasn't a direct assault. This was boarding. Vakor's stomach twisted. His fleet was in disarray. His supply chains were gone. His defenses were faltering. And now, intruder alert on multiple decks. The emergency lockdown protocol snapped into place, steel barriers hissing into position along the corridors. Vakor straightened, breath steady despite the chaos. He turned to Sirik, and for the first time since they had met, he saw unease in her gaze. "We hold the Varakis," he said firmly. "We are not out of this yet." But deep down, beneath the layers of control and confidence, he knew better. This wasn't a battle. This wasn't a war. This was the dismantling of an empire. Vakor braced against the trembling bulkhead of the Varakis, his balance shifting as the deck buckled beneath his feet. Alarms shrieked through the corridors, red hazard lights pulsing like a dying heartbeat. The acrid sting of electrical fires thickened the air, laced with the metallic tang of blood. "Security teams report," he snarled into his command interface. The response was garbled panic. "Can't see them. Shadows moving in the ventilation. They took Deck 4 without firing a shot." A cold realization settled into his bones. They weren't dealing with an invasion. They were being hunted. Admiral Sirik Halos moved beside him, her coat scorched from an earlier blast, her movements clipped but controlled. "They've severed internal comms," she muttered. "Tactical readouts are unreliable. We're operating blind." Vakor clenched his jaw. How? How did humans dismantle centuries of defensive doctrine without deploying a traditional war fleet? Where were their flagships, their battle formations, their declarations? Where was the war he had been trained to fight? They're already inside the hull, Sirik continued, scanning the heads-up display with sharp efficiency. Boarding pods didn't breach from external impact. These ships were already here. A pit formed in his stomach. Explain. She tapped into the security logs, filtering through ghost entries, unauthorized access points that predated the attack. They've been here for weeks. A long pause. Then, months. Vakor stilled. His mind flashed back to the endless fleet reports, the unchallenged supply runs, the neutral cargo haulers docking in their shipyards without suspicion. The humans hadn't just infiltrated the Varakis. They had lived in its walls, every bulkhead, every vent, every sealed compartment, waiting. A sickening certainty clawed through him. They hadn't taken Deck 4. Deck 4 had never belonged to them in the first place. Sir. A voice crackled through what remained of the command channel. Korath Mav. His normally measured cadence was fractured, like a man who had just glimpsed something that refused to make sense. You need to see this. The command center was a wreck of shattered displays and overturned consoles. Smoke curled from the exposed wiring, twisting in the emergency lights like restless specters. Mav stood at the central tactical interface, his rigid posture betraying a rare unease. Security feed from the lower decks, he said without preamble, keying in the playback. The laser plasma display flared to life, broadcasting a frozen frame of Deck 12, a barricaded checkpoint, armed Concord soldiers, a single human prisoner. Vakor narrowed his eyes. Survivor? Mav's mandibles twitched. Keep watching. The footage resumed. The humans stood motionless, unarmed. The Concord officers, 5 in total, had their rifles raised, their postures tense. The airlocks behind them sealed shut, locking them inside the checkpoint. Then the lights flickered. The human moved. Vakor stiffened. It wasn't combat. It wasn't retreat. It was dissection. The feed stuttered, frames jumping as the 5 officers fell without a single wasted motion, not one gunshot, not one scream. Their bodies hit the deck before their weapons did. And the human. He kept walking. The silence that followed was unbearable. Vakor turned to Sirik, who stared at the screen with unreadable intensity. This isn't conventional warfare, she said at last. These aren't shock troops. They're executioners. The revelation settled like a physical weight. The humans weren't winning through firepower. They were winning through inevitability. A slow, calculated dismantling of everything the Concord had built, and Vakor finally understood. It was never about invasion, he murmured. Sirik met his gaze. No. Her voice was steady. It was about demonstrating something. A cold certainty slithered through him. What? She glanced at the display, the image of the lone human standing over the bodies of trained officers. That there is no war to fight. Because they've already won. The ISS Revenant floated in the remains of a dead patrol squadron, its hull dark, its weapons silent. Inside, Ven stood in the dim glow of the tactical bay, watching as the final Concord supply lines collapsed. They're beginning to understand, Nova remarked, arms crossed, studying the intercepted transmissions. The Concord's fleet cohesion was disintegrating, admirals contradicting orders, captains overriding central command, entire planetary colonies falling silent as their power grids failed, one by one, not through combat, through absence. How long before Vakor makes the call? Drast mused, leaning against the bulkhead. Ven's fingers drummed against the console. He already knows the answer, he murmured, but he hasn't accepted it yet. Nova tilted her head, considering. You think he'll fight to the last? Ven shook his head. No. The laser plasma display shifted, highlighting the final remnants of the Concord's authority, the few warships that hadn't been compromised, the last outpost still transmitting distress calls. He'll run. Drast exhaled through his nose. And when he does, Ven's gaze didn't waver. We close the door behind him. On the Varakis, the emergency beacon flared to life. Vakor barely reacted. His focus was locked on the tactical display, on the empty channels where entire fleets had once been. Sirik stood beside him, silent. They had lost. Not in battle, not in a great final stand, but in a quiet, suffocating collapse. A slow removal from history. Vakor closed his eyes. "Prepare my personal escort," he ordered. "We're leaving." Sirik didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. She simply watched as the last authority of the Galactic Concord turned his back on the empire he had once ruled. And as the Varakis' engines ignited, disappearing into the void, she knew humanity wasn't done yet. The Varakis cut through the void, a wounded predator retreating into the dark. Its escorts, a once imposing fleet of Concord warships, had dwindled to barely a handful. The rest had been left behind, stranded, dismantled, or turned into debris fields that still flickered with the dying glow of their own destruction. Vakor stood motionless in his private chamber, claws curled against the console as he stared at the heads-up display. The Empire was gone. The fleet was scattered, the war machine reduced to a hollowed-out husk. Yet even now a small, treacherous thought remained. This is not the end. A low vibration rippled through the deck, not an attack, an activation. The Varakis' deep space jump array had been brought online, the last fallback route, mapped only for the highest-ranking officials. A sanctuary, a place to rebuild. Admiral Sirik Hollow stepped forward, her coat still bearing the burns and cuts of the earlier conflict. Her silver eyes reflected the dying embers of the Empire on the screen before them. "You think they'll let us escape?" It wasn't a question. Vakor's mandibles twitched. "They would have stopped us by now if they wanted to." The words rang hollow even as he said them, because deep down he knew the truth. The humans had not fired upon the Varakis. They were watching, waiting, the way a predator lets wounded prey stagger forward, believing it still has a chance. The ship trembled again, only this time it wasn't the jump array. The lights dimmed. The heads-up displays flickered. Then, silence. Not static, not interference, just absence. Sirik's breath hitched. They're here. Somewhere beyond the shattered borders of conquered space, aboard the ISS Revenant, Commander Ragos Ven studied the laser plasma display with quiet finality. The Varakis had entered its final escape trajectory. "They think they're leaving," Nova muttered beside him. Ven didn't respond. His gaze remained on the screen. The moment Vakor activated the deep space jump array, the inevitable sequence had begun. The ship's navigation would route through the last remaining Concord-controlled channels. And that was the mistake. "Phase 2 is active," Drast confirmed from the command terminal. His voice carried no satisfaction, only the cold efficiency of a man watching a machine collapse under its own weight. Ven exhaled slowly. It was never about chasing them. Nova tilted her head, waiting. Then what was it about? The heads-up display shifted, data streams rewriting themselves in real time. The Varakis' escape jump, its last chance, wasn't leading them to safety. It was leading them exactly where humanity wanted them to go. The Varakis lurched violently as the ship dropped out of the jump corridor, its hull groaning in protest. The deep space viewport shifted, revealing a graveyard of metal. Vakor's blood ran cold. They had not arrived at a sanctuary. They had arrived at a killing ground. Shattered warships, some conquered, some belonging to other civilizations that had dared cross humanity in the past, drifted through the black, their hulls torn open like gutted carcasses. And beyond them, waiting, was something else entirely. A fleet, not the ghost fleet, not repurposed freighters, not scavenged war machines. This was the real military, the ones who had not yet been called, the ones who had been waiting. Vakor felt his throat tighten as he took in the size of it. Colossal dreadnoughts, bristling with weaponry that should not have existed yet. Hunter-killer cruisers, their hulls designed to fracture into shifting segments mid-battle. Planetary assault carriers, their launch bays open like waiting maws. And at the center, a single vessel, larger than anything in the Concord's history. The ISS Immolation, a supercarrier forged not for war, but for annihilation. Vakor inhaled sharply. This... His voice faltered. Sirik did not look away from the viewport. They weren't fighting us before. Her words felt like the edge of a blade. They were waiting for us to meet their actual military. The first transmission came through. A simple, unencrypted message. Vakor, Sirik, stand by. Vakor exhaled sharply, claws flexing. For what? The answer came in the form of movement. The immolation began to shift, not forward, down. It was positioning itself between them and the nearest system, cutting off escape without firing a single shot. A second transmission followed. You wanted war. The display shifted to battle mode. Weapons systems spooled to life. The voice continued, calm. You never fought us. The immolation began opening its planetary siege bays. Now, you will. Vakor straightened. Prepare for combat. Sirik turned sharply. You don't mean that. He did because he knew there was no surrender here. Not anymore. And as the first human assault vessels broke formation, closing the distance in a silent, merciless approach, he finally understood. This wasn't a last stand. It was an execution. The Varakis trembled as its automated systems fought to correct course. Warning indicators flooded the heads-up display, blinking like distress beacons in a storm. Across the bridge, officers scrambled to re-establish formation, but it was futile. They weren't just outmatched. They were outplayed. Vakor straightened, his mandibles tightening. His talons gripped the console, knuckles paling as he stared at the formation of human warships shifting into position. The ISS Immolation, humanity's largest supercarrier, loomed in the center, its silhouette casting a shadow over the broken fleet like an unspoken sentence. All ships, battle formation Epsilon, he ordered. A hesitation spread through his crew. Sirik Halos met his gaze from across the command deck, her expression unreadable. You're ordering a formation meant for planetary defense, she murmured. Vakor didn't answer. He knew it. They all did. This wasn't a fleet prepared for war. It was a fleet that had already lost. We fight, he said instead, voice even. Because the alternative was acknowledging what they all feared, that this was not a battle. This was a lesson, and humanity intended to make sure they learned it. Aboard the ISS Revenant, Commander Regos Ven watched the Concord fleet scramble into formation. Too slow, too chaotic. A game of desperation, not strategy. Nova's fingers danced over the battle interface, her expression unreadable. They're moving like an animal that knows it's already been caught, she said. Cornered animals are dangerous, Drast muttered. Ven studied the display. Yes. But not when they have nowhere to run. The Concord's tactics had always relied on overwhelming control, logistics, coordination, firepower. But their networks were fractured, their supply lines empty, their warships stripped of the very fuel they needed to retreat. They had nothing, and now they were about to realize it. Ven exhaled, eyes flicking toward the fleet formations shifting into their final positions. Signal the immolation. Tell them to initiate Phase 3. Nova nodded once and sent the transmission. The final act had begun. The first strike came not as a volley of missiles or plasma fire, but through silence. Across the Concord fleet, systems flickered, weapon arrays stuttering offline, thrusters misfiring, shields collapsing into failure states. Confusion spread like wildfire. We're losing reactor control. Targeting systems are non-responsive. Admiral, we can't... Sirik Halos stood frozen as the reports came in, her mind working through the horror unfolding before her. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't an attack. It was humanity closing the door. Every single Concord ship, from the smallest frigate to the largest dreadnought, had been compromised. Their navigational relays, their reactor cores, their emergency fallback routes, not through hacking, not through brute force, but through their own trust. Decades of trade agreements, joint operations, technological sharing. Human contractors had maintained their security networks. Human technicians had repaired their engines. Human merchants had installed the very systems they now relied upon, and humanity had waited. They rigged it from the beginning, she breathed. Vakor's claws dug into the armrest of his command chair, his mind spiraling through the ramifications. The humans could have shut them down whenever they wanted. The only reason they hadn't? Because they wanted the Concord to understand what had been done to them before they fell. Aboard the ISS Immolation, Fleet Marshal Corsa Adakir stood at the heart of the tactical command deck, hands clasped behind his back. The room pulsed with quiet efficiency, officers awaiting his command, their faces impassive as the battle unfolded in its inevitable rhythm. "Final lockout complete," a lieutenant reported. Adakir nodded. "Hold fire." A murmur of confusion rippled through the deck. Ven's voice came through the command link, even, measured. "They need to feel it first." Adakir watched. On the heads-up display, Concord warships drifted helplessly, trapped in the iron grip of their own technology, a fleet without control, an empire without power. For years, the Concord had called humans barbarians, uncivilized, inferior. And yet, here they were, not through conquest, not through fire and blood, but through a simple truth. Humanity had never needed to fight this war, because they had already won it, before it ever began. Adakir exhaled. "Open channel." The transmission pulsed outward. Across every conquered vessel, a single voice cut through the silence. "Surrender is no longer an option." Vakor stared at the broadcast, his jaw tight. "Then what do you want?" The response came without hesitation. A reminder, and then the weapons came online. The first barrage was surgical. Humanity didn't waste munitions on destruction. They aimed for the life support systems. Ventilation networks, atmospheric processors, oxygen levels plummeted, heat vanished from corridors. Ships became tombs before the crew even knew they were dying. No messy firefights, no glorious last stands, just cold, methodical death. Inside the Varakis, Sirik felt her lungs constrict as the temperature dropped sharply. "They're not attacking us," she realized, her breath visible in the freezing air. Vakor swallowed, eyes dark. "They're erasing us." Ven watched from the Revenant's command bay, his expression unreadable. Nova's voice broke the silence. "Final Concord transmissions have ceased. They're trying to isolate command nodes, but we've already buried their backups." Ven nodded. "Give them 20 minutes. Drast raised a brow. "To do what?" Ven turned, gaze sharp. "To understand." He wanted them to sit in the cold, to feel their voices fall silent one by one, to know what it meant to be helpless. Only then would humanity deliver the final message. Nova's fingers hovered over the console. "And when the time's up?" Ven exhaled. "Then we tell them what happens next." Vakor sat in the frozen quiet of the Varakis, breath shallow, his exoskeleton stiff from the creeping cold. The ship no longer felt like his. The command decks, the corridors, even the very air, none of it belonged to the Concord anymore. It belonged to the silence, to the inevitable. The display in front of him flickered, a single transmission feeding through the remnants of their crippled communications. No encryption, no pretense, just a voice. "High Minister Vakor," said Regos Ven. There was no arrogance in the way he spoke, no anger, no gloating, just the weight of something that had already been decided. Vakor let out a slow breath, his claws curled against the dead console. "You could have ended this with fire," he rasped. "We did," Ven replied. The meaning settled between them, heavier than any weapon. Vakor turned his gaze toward the viewport, where the remains of his fleet hung in the dark, adrift, powerless. The weapons had gone silent. The desperate calls for reinforcement had faded into static. Even the flagship's reactor core had cooled into useless steel. They were ghosts now. The empire that once commanded half the known galaxy wasn't even worth the bullets required to finish it. Vakor's mandibles clicked once, a bitter sound. "You wanted us to understand something," he said. "Yes, then say it." There was a pause. Then, "You thought war was a test of strength," Ven said quietly. That victory belonged to the one who held the bigger gun, the larger fleet, the superior numbers. Vakor closed his eyes. But war, Ven continued, isn't about who fires first or who stands tallest. It's about who can afford to lose everything and still be standing when the fires die out. A slow, sinking realization clawed through Vakor's chest. This was never a war. No, Vakor opened his eyes. Then what was it? There was no hesitation in Ven's response, a demonstration. Silence stretched between them, not the kind that came from a lull in battle, but the kind that came when one side had nothing left to say. Vakor turned away from the viewport, forcing his body upright, the weight of failure pressing against his shoulders. What happens now? He wasn't sure if he meant for himself, for the remnants of his people, or for the empire that no longer existed, but Ven already had the answer. We let you tell them. Vakor's breath stilled. You let me? Your surrender means nothing, Ven said. Your fleets are dead. Your colonies abandoned. Your supply chains, ours. There is no one left to negotiate with. The words sliced deeper than any weapon. Then why not finish it? The laser plasma display shifted, and for the first time, Vakor saw the full scope of the human fleet. Not just the warships that surrounded them, but the others. The ones still waiting in the black. They hadn't deployed everything. They had held back. Because extinction is mercy, Ven said. And you don't deserve it. Vakor's mind reeled, his claws digging into the armrest. So you will let us crawl? Let us suffer in the ruins of our own making? Yes. It was worse than execution. They had expected war. They had expected a bloodied battlefield, where even in defeat they could find honor. But there was nothing honorable about this. This was not a defeat. This was irrelevance. What do I tell them? Vakor murmured. Tell them what happens when you try to take everything from a species that knows how to survive without anything, Ven said. His voice held no hatred, no anger, just the unshakable certainty of a lesson that had been taught. Tell them what it cost you. The transmission ended. Vakor sat there, staring at the empty screen, his own reflection barely visible in the fractured glass. Behind him, Sirik Halos spoke for the first time in what felt like an eternity. What do we do now? Vakor exhaled. We survive. The words felt alien in his mouth. For so long, survival had been a given, a thing the Concord enforced upon others, a thing they controlled through strength, diplomacy, or sheer inevitability. But now, for the first time in his long, decorated existence, he understood what it meant to be on the other side of history. To have nothing, to have no one, to be forced to adapt or disappear. Vakor stood, his body aching from more than just the cold. He looked out at the remains of what had once been his empire, and knew. This was not humanity's victory. It was their warning.